Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're very grateful to have Nate Pennington from Pumpkin County Planning Department here with us today. But before Nate does his presentation, wanted to invite Dylan Sheps from Vista Home Inspections up. Dylan's sponsoring our lunch today, so give him a round of applause. And
Hello, everyone. I'm going to make this quick. Just want to introduce myself. I am Dylan Sheps. I'm the owner of Vista Inspections. I offer, as you might have guessed, inspection services for real estate transactions. That could be pre-listing inspections, buyer's inspections. Obviously, I do a great deal of buyer's inspections. Also, homeowner maintenance inspections. I recommend that, especially post-storm. If you had any damage to your home, if you had a lot of water in your basement like I did. There's not a single dry basement in Western North Carolina. I don't care what anybody says. So it can be a good idea to get somebody to come and take a look. Obviously, for any clients you have, buyers you have, folks that are interested in listing their homes, I highly recommend getting inspections done. I do radon testing as well, pest inspection, septic, well, air and water quality testing, basically anything that pertains to the safety and health of your homes. I cover that because we don't just want safe homes, we want healthy homes. So we can get in there and take a look at everything. Right now, the market is in a very weird place, as you all know, that are in this industry. But I see a lot of signs of hope. I think we're at about 6.1 months of inventory as of end of June, which is over 100% increase from last year in June this time. Those are just some statistics that you all are probably well aware of. But I do see a lot of interest in the area still. I was attracted to this area more than 20 years ago. The mountains called to me. I think that pretty much everybody that ever visits Western North Carolina, the mountains call to them in a similar way. So I think, like I said, there's still a lot of interest, and I think that we have a robust market and a lot of folks that want to move here and want to live here. And we're starting to see a lot of price adjustments happen because when inventory goes up, you got to make some adjustments. So anyway, I'd love to be a bridge for you and your clients. I consider myself something of an anchoring force. I went to school for mass communications, grew up in a contractor's household, spent a lot of time on job sites, but ended up going to school, wanted to be a journalist. That did not work out, but I'm very thankful. This is the most favorite job I've ever had in my life. I consider myself something of a detective, getting in and taking a look at homes and finding out what's wrong with them, also what's right with them. So like I said, I'd like to be an anchoring voice for you and your clients, a bridge between the sellers and the buyers and you as agents or any other industry professionals. So anyhow, thank you all very much for being here. I'm going to let Nate get to it, and I'm very excited to learn about what he's got to tell us as well. So thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you. What's happening, Lotsar? Thank you all for having me. I know a lot of y'all here, just people I don't know. So I hope you find today's presentation interesting. For those of y'all that know me, I'm accessible. You can give me a call. I'm not a person that sits in an ivory tower. I'm happy to talk to anyone that wants to give me a call. In fact, I just spoke to this lady right over here, and we had a conversation the other day, and she came up to me and she was like, "Are you in the Helene department?" And I said, "I'm in a lot of departments." So yeah, we had a great conversation about Beacon Village, which is applicable to, I think, today's conversation. And before I get into it, can we do a moment of silence for our friend Byron Griner? Thank you. All right, so we're entitling this one, "The Norm is Upset." Someone just said something that I want to reiterate. There's not a dry basement in Western North Carolina. Keep that in mind at all times. Okay, so I am the planning director for the county. I have been with the county for 10 years. Previously, I was with the city of Asheville for 9 years. Before that, I was in the Florida Keys for 3 years. Before that, I worked in Knox County, Tennessee, when I was getting my master's degree in urban and regional planning. The CFM after my name stands for Certified Floodplain Manager. So if you want to say, hey, Nate, what have you been doing over the past year? I think it speaks for itself. That being said, it's a perfect opportunity to talk about adaptation to change. So pre-Helene, the planning department was working on a very controversial topic. Anybody know what we were working on?
Short-term rentals.
Well, times have changed. We had Helene happen. Short-term rentals actually served a very noble purpose to get people into permanent housing. And the market has changed. I just heard that there's 6 months of inventory, but the market has obviously been impacted in the tourism industry as well. For over 100 years, this area has been home to tourism as an integral part of our economy. Tourism is the thing that will actually help bring us back. We know that there's a lot of state and federal dollars that we're waiting on. FEMA reimbursements can take years after a storm. So in a lot of parts, a lot of communities that undergo such a severe tragedy, it's the local economy that brings it back. So always keep that in mind. And when we talk about adaptation to change, we pivoted to our needs for now. And those things involve passing an emergency housing amendment, which allowed people to stay on their property, live in RVs, do things like that to rebuild their homes. We are having to look at economic recovery options. So planners always have to be ready to change at a moment's notice, and that's exactly what we have done. We had over 1,000 landslides just in Buncombe County. We're going to talk a little bit about steep slope and protected ridge overlays, debris flow pathways. We're going to talk a lot about risk. What I'd like to do, though, is wrap up the presentation fairly quickly and leave the rest of the time for questions. And then tell you all about some of the complaints that we've been experiencing lately, because these complaints are going to influence some of the conversations that you have with your clients as they look at these houses. We'll talk a little bit about flood ordinance revisions, and we'll see where the conversation goes. Sounds good? So this was a perfect storm. The setup, do y'all remember the day before the storm, we had probably some of the most intense rainfall I've ever seen in my lifetime. That put water at the banks or even over the banks. I was in the emergency operations center the day before getting ready for this. And I remember I was like, what's that sound? And that was the just extreme rainfall. Now y'all remember too, we had a drought, pretty good drought before then. So the ground was hard packed. The ground was not allowing any water to really get into the ground, saturated and be absorbed. And then unfortunately, Helene picked up what's called forward speed, and it came in at a clip. 23 miles per hour was the forward speed. Now that doesn't have anything to do with the rotational speed, but the rotational speed unfortunately put a full-blown tropical storm over Western North Carolina for, I believe, the first time. Now there was a terrible storm in the late 1700s, but I don't have a lot of information on that. So we had a full-blown tropical storm over the mountains. And that's going to be important when we talk about blowdowns and how blowdowns happened in just a second. In the red, those are hurricane force winds. If y'all are selling properties up on Elk Mountain Scenic Highway or up on near the Parkway or in Barnardsville, look at this image, because this tells you everything. The south and east facing slopes with the rotational speed of the storm, those are going to pick up the highest wind speeds. The rest of the areas receive tropical storm force winds. One thing to keep in mind over the escarpment, over the eastern escarpment of Buncombe County, I live in Ridgecrest. We took 30 inches of rain over the 2-day period where we had that. So that hypersaturated the soils, and it also turbocharged the watershed. up at the beginning. Does anybody know where the Swananoa River begins? Tell me the property where the Swananoa River begins. Ridgecrest Conference Center. So when you see damages at the Ridgecrest Conference Center and the scouring up at the upper reaches of the river before you even hit a special flood hazard area, you know you're in trouble. The east side's always the dirty side. So no matter, look at that forecast track. Here's where it went. Everybody always puts too much attention on this damn. That is not where the worst damages occur. The worst damages are always on that east side. And look at the moisture that it wrung out. Now we got another system down in the Gulf right now. That's going to probably go over to Louisiana, but it's still going to wring out moisture on the mountains. That's the dynamics of the mountains. Records. Now the French Broad itself, about a foot over the 1916 storm, but look at the Swananoa. Blew it out by almost 7 feet. That is insane, because what happens in the Swananoa happens in the French Broad. All that water's got to go somewhere. It picks up all those tributaries and it turbocharges that water. And I'll give you the presentation too. Has anybody ever seen a blowdown before? Has anybody been to the West Coast and been to Oregon and Washington? So when they actually, they have signs. If you drive along the Pacific Ocean, they say blowdown when it occurred. So blowdowns are a bit unique. They're not tornadoes. It's an extreme force of wind that usually hits, usually disproportionately, the south and east facing slopes, depending on the rotational winds. You hypersaturate the soils with as much rain as we have, and you add tropical storm force winds, you're going to blow down every single tree. That's a picture right there of Elk Mountain Scenic Highway. Every single tree on that property is blown down. It disproportionately affected a lot of our red and white oak species in particular. So the trees that usually are the sturdiest, that we always think are going to do well in the storms, those are the ones that fell down. Biltmore Forest had some of the most extreme, they had a lot of old trees and a lot of big heavy pines, and they definitely took it on the nose in Biltmore Forest. Worst areas, Bee Tree, if you drive up in there, it just got all in that cove and it matchsticked. Our reservoirs are all located in the areas, so they saw the blowdowns there. Then they had all the sediment laden water. That's what flipped the reservoirs and caused our water crisis. Look at that landslide map. So you can obviously see in the county, all of our higher elevations are in the 4 quadrants: northeast, southeast, northwest, and southwest. 9 was particularly hard hit, Barnersville, but these are the actual landslides. Now, unfortunately, we are blessed and unblessed with a couple of things. We have a lot of green mountains, and the green mountains, of course, are caused by the degradation of granites into soils. We get the mountains, so we don't look like the Himalayas anymore. Unfortunately, we have a lot of unstable soils because of the breaking down of all this material, and those are called colluvial soils. The colluvial soils mean that they didn't exist on the property. They've slid. Our mountains have slid for hundreds of thousands of years, and they'll continue to slide. It is the nature of the beast. So years ago, we did what's called, y'all are familiar with the steep slope and the protected ridge overlays. It's not a prohibition, but we do make people do things like hire a geotechnical engineer to make sure that you put your foundation to a depth that your house isn't going to slide off a hill. It is a life safety ordinance. What we saw, and I'm going to show you this in a second because it's spooky crazy how it matches up. We have mapped debris flow pathways. Now, who's looked at the debris flow pathways on GIS? Okay. So, for years, I've heard this is confusing. We don't get it. Well, they match up almost perfectly with the overlays. Blue Ridge Assembly, who's been to that beautiful YMCA campus? Okay, Blue Ridge Assembly is covered up with historic landslides. In fact, that's why when you go into the entrance, it's so flat. It just gradually kind of, so think of thousands of years of sliding and sliding and sliding and sliding. In fact, that whole range going down to Black Mountain's like fingers. And that's a very steep range. So in the future, we will be looking at some amount of regulation with debris flow pathways. I can't tell you what that's going to look like. Right now, it's for awareness. But when you advise folks and you see debris flow pathways and they're from Texas or Indiana, you need to remind them of what the potential is. They are buying risk. And that's going to be our theme in just a second. That's Blue Ridge Assembly. All right, what do we got going on here? Affected ridge. Affected ridge is going to follow that ridge line all along that range, okay? Blue, steep slope overlay. Teal, potential debris flow pathways. Guess what orange is? Historic debris flow pathways. What happened here? Eureka Hall, huge slide. I'm meeting with Melissa Logan on Friday on campus. Look at this particular slide right here. See what I'm talking about? How many people get folks from all across the country that say the following? I want a piece of property with a view and a babbling brook. There's our stream layer, okay? Streams flow into tributaries, flow into rivers, and guess what? They all flood. I don't care about the special flood hazard area. Sure, it's important. But when you build next to a babbling brook, the babbling brook becomes your worst enemy in a Helene. And on top of that, when you start layer caking everything together, what do we got? Protected ridge, steep slope, potential debris flow pathways, historic debris flow pathways, floodway, floodplain. When you talk about risk in the mountains, folks, that doesn't leave a lot of areas that are not affected by some type of risk. You guys are my best friends because you're out there with me training people and telling people the story about what they're buying. It's not a bad thing. It's just the area that we live in. I want to talk about this a lot, assessing risk. I got a call the other day from WLOS, and the story was, Nate, there's this group called First Street, and they said this property is risky and it's not in a floodplain. Okay, let's have a look at the property. Right next to a stream in a debris flow pathway. I can't tell you much about First Street and groups like this. They're proprietary. They have their algorithms, but they are working with huge clients, Zillow, a lot of other different clients. What they are doing is they're running properties through a proprietary system and assigning risk. So again, unfortunately, I can't tell you much about that other than to paint the picture of what they're feeding into their system and making you all aware of this, companies like this, because this is actually going to increase, not decrease. The National Flood Insurance Program is a good program, but it is not keeping up with climate and where we are. So every day we've gotten what? 2-inch rain event, 3-inch rain event. Like the atmosphere is holding more moisture, and that is leading to some pretty ferocious downpours. Again, it's risk. What is really tiny, and I'm not sure. Okay, that's out of the hazard mitigation plan, but basically what that says. How many of you are familiar with the hazard mitigation plan? Yes, flood is one component. You better have a hazard mitigation plan in place. We do, we're current, we're good, okay? That's run through my department and emergency services. What the hazard mitigation plan does is it looks at what risks affect a particular community. It's also important because after an event like this, how many people have heard of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program? All right, so we need to talk about that a little bit. In order to get programs like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program to come to town, and right now it's doing a number of different things that are being offered to homeowners. It's being operated through the state as a state-centered model, and it does the following: acquisition of properties, elevation of properties, tearing down existing structures and building them to modern standards. Now, it's historically been used from a flood perspective. It was the quickest I've ever seen a hazard mitigation grant program stood up in my career. We got it stood up pretty quick. Now, a lot of that has to do because we do have a good hazard mitigation plan. We are fortunate to live in a state to where I can pick up the phone and call Steve Garrett at the National Flood Insurance Program coordinator. We have resources here that other states don't. Other states have to go directly through FEMA. Now, does anybody want to talk directly to FEMA? I would prefer not to as well. So, point being is we have a lot of resources here, and we can get into those during the question time. But when we talk about assessing risk, we also have our mapping and our floodplain maps. The next map cycle are about 3 to 4 years out, okay? I put proprietary there because the modeling of groups like First Street, Carfax, any type of group like that, they're going to have their own private systems that unfortunately, a lot of them also won't talk to you. So don't call First Street. They're going to say, show me the money, pay me. Factoring and pricing risk. However, if you want to know more about First Street, perhaps LOTSAR could be a resource that you could talk to them and see what they could find out as well. Do I need flood insurance? Hell yeah, you need flood insurance. Not only do you need flood insurance in a special flood hazard area, you need flood insurance next to that babbling brook. So when I lived in Black Mountain, my neighbor Gene, he had a babbling brook. 3 times when I lived there, and I lived there 17 years, I saw that babbling brook flood his basement, not in a special flood hazard area. By the way, that babbling brook is Tomahawk Branch, which makes Lake Tomahawk. If you have a high water table, my house in Black Mountain, nowhere in the special flood hazard area, slope built in the 70s, cut into the slope, high water table, flooded it. I lost an entire finished basement. After Helene, well, the home's in rough shape. It took 3 trees, the slope liquefied, and it knocked out the very nice deck and carport as well. That is a great question. Most of the time during excavation, you might hit some groundwater. If you're in the homes that are most susceptible are going to be ones that are cut into a slope, especially on the wet slope sides. You know, sometimes you have the dry slope and the wet slope. You need to look for rhododendrons and mountain laurels. Those are typically a dead giveaway. Also, mountain laurels and rhododendrons are very flammable. They come with lots of resins inside them. So from a fire safe perspective, want to kind of keep those away from homes. There's numerous ways, geotechnical exploration. If you're dealing with an older home, the first thing I would do is recommend as part of due diligence. This gentleman right here said it too. He does these type of inspections. But I know for my house in Black Mountain, I had to hire a local group, Basement and Radon Solutions, and they came in and basically I had a slab without gravel underneath it. I had a high water table, and they had to, when I tore out my whole basement, they cut a trench in, they put a sump pump, and then I also got a marine battery backup because when you lose power, that's the time you need it the most. So there's numerous different clues, but I would say that your inspectors are definitely those people. They're going to look for signs. They're going to look for moist corners. They're going to look at block walls if one's available. You can see moisture there. So it just really depends.
How's it different if you have springs?
Springs. Grovemont is full of them. So springs are tricky because springs can be existing springs. They can be wet weather springs that pop up during times of a lot of rainfall. I actually saw some springs that the dynamics completely changed underground. We had folks in Grove calling that said, my entire yard's full of cobbles. What happened? Well, rivers and streams change all the time throughout history. Does anybody ever watch the Alaska shows, the gold mining? They're always looking for the ancient riverbeds. And so when they did a neighborhood like Grovemont, they just went, and guess what? There's streams. I showed you the map. There's streams all over the place. But yeah, we do have springs that pop up too. Again, tricky. It's almost like whack-a-mole.
So when we see those little blue lines on GIS that show a stream, but you're there and there's no stream, does that mean there's really a stream under the house?
Great question. So we have different things going on. You have blue line streams. You have streams that are always holding water. You have perennial streams. You have ephemeral streams. You have, does anybody remember going outside after Helene and listening and being like, holy crap, I've never seen water flow over here. So that's when you start getting into your ephemerals. These are, as we know in the mountains, every fold is going to convey water at some point. When you run across, or if you ever have a question, the best thing I would recommend is always call a planner. Start there, and then the planner may recommend some other further exploration, perhaps with a geotechnical engineer, surveyor. We can look at different soil maps, different things like that. There's so many different variations and combinations. The best advice I can give you is, if you even suspect an issue, call us. Okay, back to this. If you're near significant impervious areas, Ingalls and Swannanoa, the front door is 700 feet from a special flood hazard area. Ingalls took 2 to 3 feet of water. Okay, significant impervious areas, hardscaping, roads, debris dams caused by Whitson Avenue Bridge, Riverwood Bridge, that causes a tremendous backwater effect. All of these factors play into each other. Right there. All right, Ingalls front door. I'm sorry, 836 feet. Gas station, car wash. Ace Hardware is over here, took about 4 feet of water. I put this one on here because I really want folks to understand that, guys, it doesn't just flood in the special flood hazard area. It floods in proximity to it as well. This was a 1,000-year event. Will this ever happen again? No one can answer that. I would prepare for it to happen again because 1916, I have a picture of the 1977 tobacco barn. When it was tobacco, flooded. 2004, we had, how many people were here then? Okay. I was in South Florida watching those storms come right on up. Talked about the backwater effects, debris dams form, we have older infrastructure. So if you were to build a bridge over the Swannanoa in that area today, it would probably look very different to meet modern standards, but those bridges are very old. Also, you want to have an at-grade crossing. What happens is when you have the forces that we have, starting up at Ridgecrest, and you're like, I'm going to take this house, I'm going to take these trees, I'm going to take these cars, and it all comes in a crescendo down the valley at extreme velocities. And the first thing it's going to encounter, it's going to find a way around it. So I'm going to hit Whitson Avenue, and I'm going to go right around it. Then I'm going to hit Riverwood, and then I'm going to have this tremendous backwater effect that creates massive flooding. Even worse, I'm going to get around those bends of the river, around the Swannanoa, it makes its way into Asheville, and I'm going to go straight. Did y'all see the root bar after the event? There's a pool table sticking outside the window. Root bar is not in the special flood hazard area. That's a canyon effect for it. So you've got that deep channel there, and you've got that water screaming through there, and it's got nowhere to go. Sure, that's why we lost the Zaxby's. That's why the Veterans Restoration Quarters. That's why we scoured out that bridge and had to work with the VA and the Emergency Operations Center to get them a detour. That's why those things happen. Riverine and mountain velocity complex, that's my fancy way of saying I would much rather take a coastal storm any day because it's a little more predictable. When you start talking about turbocharging water off these mountains and getting into rivers, it's scary. I don't need to tell that to anybody in this room. There are things we can do. Most importantly, I think one of the things that we're working on with emergency services and the state and federal government is some type of warning system. That gets tricky. You also have to think about battery backups and things like that if we do lose power. But we can also do things like minimize and mitigate risk. So the hazard mitigation grant program, as you all know, some of our older housing stock, Swananoa in particular. Ma'am, you live in Beacon Village, right? And so most of Beacon Village is actually in the 500 year. In the 500 year, I don't have any requirements. Most communities don't. Because historically, the way that NFIP was set up is it anticipated a climate like we're not experiencing now. So we're going to have to get smarter. And we're going to have to think about ways to minimize and mitigate that risk. One of the ways we can do it is joining the community rating system. Who knows this program? Does anyone know this program? All right. If we adopt higher standards through the National Flood Insurance Program, we can offer discounts to our policyholders right here in Buncombe County. So that's a goal. We identified it in the comprehensive plan, and that's something we're going to be moving into in the future. I just want to show you all a couple quick pictures. As soon as I could cut my way out of my driveway, I went straight to the Emergency Operations Center and lived there for a couple of months. It's grueling. It's 12-hour shifts. It's very high intensity. We changed emergency operations centers a number of times. We started at the Castle off New Leicester Highway. We moved to 40 Cox Avenue, then moved to the Embassy Suites. We then moved to the second floor at 200 College Street. The picture up there that I have is poor Ben Woody, city of Asheville, trying to show folks just how bad. That is a main transmission line coming out of North Fork Reservoir, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 foot men deep, so 24 feet. This was actually hardened after the 04 storms. So the incredible force of what water can do is the reason that I like to show that. You got to really pace yourself when you work in the EOC. It's a very, very stressful place. One of the first assignments as a floodplain manager, this is Swananoa, in between the Whitson Avenue and the Riverwood Bridges. Every single one of those dots represents a damage assessment. So we are required as part of the National Flood Insurance Program to do very specific assessments in the flood hazard area. However, after an event of this scale, you go out and you assess all damage. You start with a very sad assessment. That's the life safety one. That's where you see the X's. That's where you can tell there's been loss of life or a rescue. You then move into building and structural. And then you then move into your assessments, which are enhanced in the special flood hazard area. If you're in the special flood hazard area and you're not built to modern standards, we have to do what's called a substantial damage, substantial improvement. What that means is you can do repairs up to 50% of the market value. It does nothing to minimize future risk, but that is one option you have. Your other options are the hazard mitigation grant program that I just discussed, or you can elevate your home, or commercial properties actually can do what's called dry and wet flood proofing. Now, caution for anybody here that's commercial realtor, dry flood proofing, let me just name some things that were dry flood proofed. The Climax facility, the Bohemian, that was one of my projects when I worked at the city. They overtopped because you're basically building a flood wall around the structure. Okay. A flood wall is typically designed not for a 1,000-year event. So something to keep in mind. It's always best to elevate. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes for commercial structures, and a lot of like older breweries and stuff like that, you can muck them out and there's not much. Tobacco Barn had like a piece of sheet metal and some, I think it got into the heaters. And they've opened that place back up, but it is a repetitive flooding property. That being said, I told you all I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions, so I will try to answer as many questions as long as Matt says I can answer questions. Of course he did. So, what do y'all got? Fire away. Hi.
I've spent a lot of nights since I lost my house thinking about this, and why is the county trying to anticipate alternative waterways for these reservoirs when it's just too much water for it to hold? So like North Fork is sitting in the middle of a lot of mountains.
Mhm.
So couldn't pathways be built between other mountain ranges or other mountains to divert the water away from where people live? Because that dam was built, my house is 1927. That dam was built in what, like 1950? They knew when they built that reservoir that when a catastrophe happened, and it was eventually going to, that it was gonna flood everybody in my area and Peachtree and all the way down. So it was already a known risk when they built it. So is there any plan now that we know what actually is gonna happen to try to build alternative waterways, like things that aren't necessarily in use until there is a need to use them? So, those pathways would only be animals and plants and things like that. And, God bless them. I ain't saying I want them to die, but better than me. So is there any type of plan in the future to try to
Great question.
divert water somewhere else?
Yeah. So both the Bee Tree Reservoir and North Fork are operated by the city of Asheville. North Fork Reservoir is completely surrounded by watershed and cannot be developed. The planners that cited North Fork were brilliant because I swear when it's dry everywhere else, you look up and North Fork's always getting a shower. It's also perfectly situated to receive all those tributaries to recharge the reservoir itself. Specifically to your question, the county is not in control of those reservoirs. Now both dams did not breach. Bee Tree is designed a little bit different. North Fork did a huge, massive improvement a few years ago on their spillway. It's also all electronically and mechanically controlled. Unlike Bee Tree, when Bee Tree gets too full, it just overtops. And that's the way that was designed. Now, because it did not breach, we were spared an even worse disaster. Questions like that, I don't know. I will tell you that the history here, in the 1960s, TVA was going to do some flood control projects in this area, and the community said, hell no, over my dead body. Community was extraordinarily resistant to it. 2004, there was a project that was proposed with the Army Corps of Engineers, the city of Asheville, and they were going to use Warren Wilson to flood some of their fields purposely during a flood event to save Biltmore Village. That plan fell apart. So Groundhog Day is happening again, and we are having those conversations, but I can't tell you what that looks like. The last major public works project that I can think of that Army Corps was involved in was after Katrina. They built some flood controls there, but I don't know because that would be something that would be managed by it'd have to be an Army Corps level project. And since the county doesn't control those reservoirs, it's not something that we're tangentially involved in, but not actively involved in.
Mm-hmm. Well, the county and city would have to ask for the Army Corps of Engineers to come in and do something, right?
Correct.
The Army's not just sitting around thinking,
No.
man, that dam really bothers me.
Yeah, and there's another major problem here, and there's dynamics going on in Washington that I don't have to get into. There's money for it. If you do flood control projects, you are basically talking about displacing a lot of people to do those kind of projects. So there's a lot of dynamics to it. Yes, ma'am.
I have one. So many of our clients move here from afar because
Really?
they're escaping their own weather scares, right?
Mhm.
And this all sounds so bleak and scary to me. And when I look at the map of all the different hazards and I see so few pockets of safe zones, I'm just wondering, in your opinion, can you tell me how the situation here compares to other areas across the United States that people have historically been leaving because of climate change related weather issues?
Yeah, that is amazing question. We were thought of to be sort of a safe climate refuge, pre-Helene. I have a friend that lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan that tells me, no, we're actually the safe climate refuge. I'm like, well, you're freezing cold on the part of it. But to your point, yeah, I mean, we had during the boom times before Helene, I mean, how many people had a client from Texas or Florida? And Florida's always been here, but man, Texas here lately. So it's we're not a safe zone. And no place in the world is really a safe zone at this point. We can make people aware of the hazards. We can try to build more resilient, but at the end of the day, we need to keep that in the back of our minds. And unfortunately, there is just no easy way to put that. I've been asked that multiple times after the event, during, I don't know how many interviews I've done with the press, but I've got a couple coming up too, and those are kind of the themes as well.
So when we were on the phone, you explained flood mapping and how that was gonna change. And I thought I knew how the series would go for those flood maps to get redrawn and readdressed. And when you explained it, I was blown away. So can you just go through the process of flood mapping?
I can. Let's see which one I want to use. Let's use this one. Okay. First step of the process, they actually have done the first step of the process. They do it leaf off, meaning they fly using LiDAR data. LiDAR data bounces lasers off the ground. This is how this flood map was created in 2010. The purple is the floodway, the blue is the 100 year, and then you have the 500 year, which are these pockets that you see in the lighter green here.
Where is this?
This is Swanano. Okay, so you're coming out of Black Mountain and you're making your way down 70, down the Swanano Valley. So the next step of the process is all mathematical based. So it's what's called the flood insurance study. We call it the FIZ. The flood insurance study influences the maps. One site that I'd love to turn you all on to is called Frizz. We call it In Frizz We Trust. Nice. Frizz. Frizz actually allows you to now use a slider scale, and you can actually go in there and see what a 500 event looks like, what a 1,000 year event looks like. And to my point, this part's not rocket science. Now the model itself is really deep calculus. But what the slider does, it says the worse the event, the larger the flooding occurs. And these actually keep me up at night more so than this. These are limited detail study areas. This is where you don't have an identified floodway. My hope, next mapping cycle, if I have my dream, we're gonna get some floodways on these, okay? Because if you don't, you actually have to go in and interpolate where the actual non-encroachment area is, which is when you don't have a map floodway itself. So I'm very hopeful in the next mapping cycle. I will tell you this. Now here's something crazy. I do expect to see some improvements in conveyance in certain areas. Now we all know that we had some streams that might have been this. And what did they look like after Helene? I do think we're going to see some improvement in certain areas. I think we're going to see some regression in other areas. We also, a lot of people are like, well, we need new maps. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. Like I said, there's going to be some area, we don't want to rush into this. We also want to give people a break to figure things out and rebuild and do things like that. And certain areas, y'all have seen the debris removal teams. We just hit a major milestone. We are winding down the debris. The debris sites are going to be wound down. They're going to process the rest. They've got all the machinery now out of the waterways. That was super important because getting the obstructions out of the waterways actually helps us. So there are going to be projects coming up. EWP is a program called the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. So we're going to see some stream banks be rebuilt. I can't tell you any timelines on that, I can say that they're probably going to focus on the rivers, the stem rivers, French Broad, Swannanoa, and then your major tributaries as well. So all of this plays in together, but that's a high level look at how the flood mapping process works. And it'll be all public meetings. You'll see me a lot. Well, 3 to 4 years, geez. I don't know. I have to think about that. Well, you'll see somebody. You'll see floodplain managers. All right, next question.
What is the cycle time? Like, where are we at right
Okay, so we did the LiDAR. They flew over Bunker County.
now?
So the next step,
Post-Helene?
yes.
LiDAR.
Somebody Google LiDAR, LIDAR. real quick.
Got it. Who is they? Say they.
Thank you. Because we're fortunate to be in a state that's a state coordinating agency with FEMA, the state is in the driver's seat of the flood mapping program. If I pick up the phone and call Steve Garrett, the National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator for the state, it is his group that handles the mapping process. Now, the state hires a consultant, and that's how that process begins.
Do they also do the work, like you said, how everything is kind of overflows banks? Do they do that, the help to get like the Swannanoa River with the banks, controlled a little bit more?
No, that's a separate group, but it all feeds together because whatever work you do in the special flood hazard area has to be permitted. And the reason we permit that work is we make sure that it does not have a negative effect on the model. The model is what drives that floodway and the fringe or the 100-year.
Plan.
Right.
That one cycle is 3 to 5 years.
We're about 3 to 4 years out. I mean,
Is that why it's like that, so much process in getting?
they have to do every single county in the state, and they usually start east and make their way west. So
So you would expect new FEMA maps roughly in
3 years.
3 years?
Yeah, you start with receiving preliminary maps, then you go through the public hearing process. So we did this, the last time we did this was in 2010.
And will any of that process be different when we're pursuing that additional stricter requirements to get more, I forgot the name of the program.
Great question, CRS, Community Rating System. It doesn't have any effect on the maps. What it does is the following. So a couple of different things that we'll be thinking about. Right now, we already have some higher standards. So we don't just build to the base flood elevation, we build 2 feet above. That's called a freeboard. That actually helped us significantly. There were, my veterinary clinic in Swannanoa, they did okay. That's some scouring under the deck, but that building was built to modern standards. Or the ones that even flooded, they stayed on their foundations. Yeah, they took a couple feet of water. Just talking to Kirk Booth earlier about his structures on Simpson Street, but they are worlds better than what would have happened had you not been built to standards. So one of the things we're considering is a 3-foot freeboard. I think we ought to consider clarifying what a habitable structure in the floodway is. We don't want people in the floodway. We had loss of life. It's probably not a good idea to be putting RVs in the floodway anymore. I mean, these are the kind of things that if you adopt higher standards, it's a layer cake. So if we adopt higher standards, the more higher standards we adopt, the more the discount on the flood insurance. Now, some communities are the gold standard. Charlotte, Mecklenburg, they get a pretty good substantial, but they do things that I don't think work here. Like, I can't just say no more fill in the 100-year. I showed you a map of what we have left. We have to be careful. If we do too much, then we're going to impact like affordable housing. And we already know we're in a world of trouble in regards to that. So that's why it takes a lot of settling people down to not make rash knee-jerk decisions and be very methodical and build into it. Let's start at the CRS at a lower level. We can always go back and add more, but let's see how that works. That's sort of the thought process on that. Yes, ma'am.
I've been getting a lot of people who are looking at land now and wanting to build.
Yes.
And looking at with land, obviously, there's a lot of steep land available right now. How would you advise someone who's wanting to go look at some land like that? I mean, they have to get a geological engineer, the steep slope ordinances, and for construction. I mean, what do I tell them? What are the costs before you even decide to buy the land? Is kind of a number I'd like to have in my head to be able to say, and the time frame that it would take to do the due diligence.
One of the most important things I think I can do as a planning professional is education. And this is why. We should be best friends here, because I help you as much as you all help me. And when you get, okay, couple from Indiana. Hey Nate, we're looking at this property. Okay, well, it's in the steep slope overlay, so you need to do this, 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 and this. And the guy said, well, I know rock. We have rock up here. And I said, sir, you have limestone. You have very different rock than we have. We have granite, we have granitoids, we have gneiss. Very different rock than you're accustomed to. Limestone's a lot more permeable. But it's calls like that that worry me the most, because he fought me on getting the geotechnical analysis. But to your point, the first thing you do is say, great questions. We're going to sit down and call a planner or have a meeting with a planner first. That's your get out of jail free card. In terms of due diligence and what to tell people to plan for, no two properties in the county are created equal. No two properties in the county are created equally. I can't say that enough, because it impacts price differently on each piece of property. My best advice, if somebody's looking at a steep slope property, encourage them to build outside of the overlay. The overlays a lot of times don't affect every part of a property, but those overlays, remember, they layer cake in with those debris flow pathways very nicely. And the other piece of advice I would give you is to not allow someone to even consider building in a debris flow pathway. Now, certain property is going to be tricky, because you're going to find certain properties that are all eaten up and covered up with debris flow. Now, there's a lot of properties out there that are for sale that are left over from, hey, Bruce. There's a lot of properties out there that are left over from before the Great Recession. As you all recall, the ones that were here during the boom times, we were selling properties sight unseen. We were doing helicopter tours, and we were doing a lot of the steep slope and protected ridge overlays were meant to help with that, to sort of end some of the speculation and give folks a clear picture of the hazards. And that's what I would tell you on that. Always involve a planner when it comes to a steep slope property, for sure. Absolutely 1000%. Sorry.
Hey, could you take just a minute and address the third option, demo, the process, and then secondary to that, the buyout, the FEMA buyout process?
Okay. Again, we're fortunate to be in North Carolina, which means the state is running the program on behalf of FEMA. So let's see. In 2004, after 2004, we had a small hazard mitigation grant program where we did some buyouts. Who remembers Spirits on the River? Hazard mitigation grant program acquisition. Manufactured home parks in Swananoa that were flooded on old US 70. We picked up about 3 there. So that was a baby program. But basically it works like this. Okay, let's see. My home was built in 1964. I'm on old US 70. I'm in the fringe or the 100 year, and I took water up to my ceiling, which is about right. Or you might have even gone the Woodman property. Y'all saw that? Yeah. Yeah, that was basically, and it collapsed in a wall. Prime candidate for this program, but basically here's how it works. You're going to sign up with the state. The state's going to come in and they're going to look at a value pre-Helene for you. Okay? They're going to offer you that amount. If you sign the dotted line, you no longer own the property. They're going to tear down that structure. And if this is our acquisition example, okay? We are then going to deed restrict the property in perpetuity for open space use and assign it to Buncombe County. That's how acquisition works. Elevation is more straightforward. 1964 home. It had a crawl space. Now, the ones that are slab on grade are trickier. Not all homes can be elevated, unfortunately. So if you had a crawl space, I could get some timbers under there, then I can raise you. They're gonna raise you 2 feet above the base flood elevation.
My question is strictly in the context of the buyout.
Acquisition.
Commercial, not residential.
Okay, commercial.
So I'm more interested in commercial.
I am too. And I want more information on that. Unfortunately, I don't have the commercial information that I am desperately seeking. Only thing I can offer to you is commercial does have the option to go back in and retrofit it to do a dry flood proofing, or hopefully I hope to see some more information on what a commercial acquisition or mitigation program looks like. Are you thinking straight up acquisition?
Yes.
Yeah. Check back with me on that.
Because I heard that Biltmore Village specifically is struggled because even to retrofit, because it's also within the historical overlay, there's like a higher level that has to be met.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Okay.
Huge deal here. Floodplain managers have it pounded in their head never to grant variances. All right, there's one exception: historic structures. The problem with Biltmore Village is how many times has Biltmore Village flooded? On top of that, we buried utilities in Biltmore Village. Well, guess what happened? All that flooded, and that's expensive infrastructure. People are like, why don't we bury utilities? Well, A, we have rock, and B, sometimes it's more expensive to replace transformers underground than it is above, and it takes a lot longer. And that's why Biltmore Village didn't get power back for so long. There's a few different options. The city is going to have some really tough conversations soon. You can elevate some of those structures. The wooden ones typically do pretty good. They've done some smaller, like Charleston, Savannah, places like that, places where you see all the repetitive flooding. Also, at the same time, you've got the historic preservation folks that want to maintain because then you lose the context. Biltmore Village is tricky. It's in the city of Asheville. I work for Bunker.
So what about industry along that floodplain, let's say Silver Line Plastic?
Love these questions.
We're gonna let them rebuild along.
Nope, we're going to talk about that. All right, let's talk about industry now, because industry gets even more dynamic than even commercial structures. Silver Line in particular is located in the town of Woodfin. Buncombe County does provide floodplain management services to the town of Woodfin. However, I got a call the other day that said Woodfin is they've actually adopted a new ordinance and they're going to be in the driver's seat after we did all the work for Silver Line. Silver Line is a huge campus with a number of functionally obsolete buildings on it. It's also a railroad dependent industry. Industries are very tricky because industries sometimes have to be built in certain ways. The rules still apply, and so what Silver Line is elected to do is dry flood proof a couple of structures. They actually had one building that we had permitted pre-Helene that got further damaged, that they're going to abandon all like living area on the bottom floor and then just have an office on the top floor. But they're doing any number of different things. They've taken that older, longer building that they've removed all the windows, that's going to be used for storage. They are coming into compliance. But other industries have been, it's sad. Ohio Electric and Barnersville, they're not going back. You know why a lot of these industries aren't going back? Because they lost their expensive assembly lines. And a lot of times the building isn't worth the most. It's a block building. There's nothing special to it. But if I've got a $10 million assembly line and all that flooded, people are having to make tough decisions. Do I want to put that at risk again? That's why they're going to dry flood proof some of their most expensive areas. Again, it's all dependent on the specifics of a property, but there are options available to commercial properties that are not available to residential. You cannot drive flood-proof residential. Okay, so you need to look at elevation on residential. So that when I talk about the flood-proofing options, wet flood-proofing is a little bit different. That's where you actually use materials that can be inundated. Party board, cementitious, that kind of stuff. Mostly gonna be for like breweries and things like that. Yes, ma'am.
Two questions. One is, if the home was outside of the floodplain, like our home was in the 500-year floodplain.
You're technically in the floodplain, you just don't have any regulations in the 500.
So would we still qualify for the elevating out of it?
That's a great question. And absolutely, I cannot tell you what the selection process looks like through the state, but if you took water in a 500 year, which I'm assuming you did, how much did you take?
About 2.5 feet.
Where do you live? Yeah. Yeah, you're going to be a good candidate. Now, because the 500 year doesn't have the same sort of criteria as the 100 year, I'm not sure to what level they would raise you, but I would say a good benchmark would probably be at least 3 feet.
And then my other question is more on a general scale, like, I'm not sure if you asked that great question, but, obviously the news is showing us all these flash floods all over the world right now, like.
It's the hottest topic in the world right now.
Right, so like from your perspective, are these flash floods like always happening? And we're seeing more of them now and we're more aware of it because we're in Western North Carolina, or is it getting worse?
The frequency. The frequency and intensity is what I like to say. It's been a hot summer, we all agree. Right, moved here 20 years ago. I've had to change the things I plant in my garden. Okay, we all know this. Used to be Asheville 81, 82, what we've had 88, 89, 90. Also, the humidity has just been, that moisture, they call it the juiced atmosphere. I like that meteorologist out of Greenville, Spartanburg. He's got a YouTube channel and he does a really good job explaining this. The moisture in the atmosphere. We saw the afternoon thunderstorms. They build and build and build and build until they can't hold it anymore and they just let it all go. And the scary thing is you don't know where, or what if we get an east to west that fills up the valley floor? I mean, yeah, it's scary, but climate change is a very scary thing. And that's why we have to be cognizant and always aware. Can't lay down our guard. But yeah, we're seeing a lot more frequency and intensity, especially watching that system down in the Gulf now.
Super briefly, if you can, we talked about STRs at the very top of this. Am I reading through the lines correctly that conversation is just totally on hold because of this other higher priority stuff?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. My professional recommendation at this point is that we focus on restoration of our community.
The free flow and steep slope, how recent are the current maps now?
Great question. We're actually having conversations. How many are YouTube geeks?
We don't have time for you.
Well, make time for this. All right. Philip Prince is a local geologist who is a genius. He has a YouTube channel where he explained our recent earthquake. I thought the dog jumped on the bed, but he is very good about, and we've actually got a meeting with Appalachian consultants, landslide consultants, Jennifer Bauer. I was just at the Public Engineers, North Carolina. We will be discussing if there needs to be adjustments. Most of the time, the debris flow pathways are going to be pretty static. It's based on an exploration of the soils and the dynamics and the folds of the mountains and things like that. It will be interesting to see if there's some change, but that's a conversation we'll be having soon with USGS and the North Carolina Geological Society. I've got upcoming presentations coming at the Fall Floodplain Institute in Cherokee. I do expect that to be well attended, and I believe geologists and geotechnical engineers will be attending that as well. Now, what's interesting is we're not just having flood conversations, we're expanding the conversation to weather because it all layer cakes together as we saw in Helene. That is a great question and one that I'm very interested in.
So we don't know when these may be changed
I don't have that information.
or like when, when the current debris flow pathways, like how old is that mapping?
Yeah, so that came about around when we did steep slope overlay protector ridge about 2010. So about as the same age as the flood maps. However, I'm not aware of when they were actually created, so I had to get back to you on that. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What is the engagement level? I mean, it's been awesome. And like, this is great information. What is the engagement level in Yancey and Haywood? I mean, if people are looking at properties there, like, do you feel confident about the level of engagement there with their planners and?
Or even city of Ashland?
So my wife is the planning director over in Marion, and some of the stories she brings home are vastly different than I will tell you that for years and years and years, poorer communities, less affluent communities, more rural communities don't have the planning resources. They have relied heavily on the COGS, Council of Governments. So here we have the Land of the Sky. I know, not Land of the Sky Association of Realtors, but we actually have Land of the Sky. They perform planning services for smaller communities. The same holds true there. Unfortunately, I just saw some sad news that Madison County is letting their development services person go. So you kind of think, we need planners. We need people that understand earth and dirt and floods, and so it's a tricky one. I don't know. But I would say that these communities are going to have to try to find it to at least get one planner on board.
So it's a higher level of risk for buyers when they're buying in those areas.
Right. Because if you don't know what you're buying, you know, if you don't have good public resources available, I mean, I will tell you this. Some of our best partners, National Weather Service, USGS, these are federal partners. All the meteorologists, all the professionals rely on the modeling and the different things they bring to the table. Again, we have to avoid rash decisions because they have long-range implications.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So you had mentioned that you feel at some point, put some kind of restriction.
No, because I need to have those conversations with my professionals first to even begin to understand. Again, I play the long game. I am not a rash decision person. I'm very methodical. So you will know, because usually when I put something out in the atmosphere, it gets attention. Yes. Matt, do you want to just introduce slides too? Yeah. Grab those. Yeah, of course. Okay. So, it's easier for kids. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so much.